Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on all things related to narcissism, narcissistic personalities, and just difficult people all around. If you're new to this channel, welcome. Please subscribe and join this really robust community that shares lots of information above and beyond the videos in the comment section. Today we're going to take on a very interesting question, and that's the question about something that you didn't even know was lurking out there. Here we are after Halloween. There's still some stuff to be scared of. And this is the dark empath. I bet you're wondering what a dark empath is. You know what an empath is? Well, what would a dark empath be? So just when you were thinking that difficult personalities couldn't get more complicated, it gets more complicated. Now, there was a very interesting study I had the privilege to read from someone named Nadia Haim in the United Kingdom. And she wrote this paper with her colleagues both in the United Kingdom and in New Zealand. And in this paper, they describe a pattern called the dark empath. Now, to understand the dark empath, you first have to understand something that's even more scary, and that's called the dark triad. The dark triad is a sort of toxic stew of three patterns: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. This work on the dark triad has been done and presented by researchers including Paulus, Jones, and Hare. And the dark triad is a model in which these three different patterns, these three difficult patterns of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism hang together. It's a pattern characterized by exploitativeness, manipulation, superficial charm, callousness, unethical or illegal behavior entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, and lack of empathy. In other words, not a nice pattern. And many of you watching this video may have been hurt by people who had these really dark, dangerous patterns. So now imagine a person who has some of these dark patterns, but may also have what looks like empathy. Yikes. The ability, and what is empathy? The ability to be aware of the needs of another person and sometimes even respond to them. But at the same time with that empathy, they can also be manipulative and selfish. And this takes us into the world of the dark empath described by Haim and her colleagues. Personally, I find a dark empath to be more terrifying than a person who's a dark triad person. With a dark triad person, I know to be scared. A dark triad person doesn't even try to fake empathy. So there's a sort of an abrupt, menacing, dangerous feel to them. So as long as you don't get tricked by the charm, and by now you should all know a charm is dangerous. As long as you don't get tricked by the charm, you're okay. But the dark empath, that's really much more problematic. And it may get to the core of how and why people get pulled into narcissistic relationships. Listen, any of you who've been in a narcissistic relationship, you aren't stupid. You're not masochistic. You didn't set out to find someone who didn't have empathy, or didn't say, hey, I'm going to start dating and I'm going to look for someone abusive. If you got into a toxic relationship, it snuck up on you over time because there may actually have been something that did feel like empathy earlier in the relationship. The person may have been intently learning about you, studying you, responding in a way that appeared to show some interest, or at least some level of understanding of your emotions. But then, pretty soon thereafter, you saw the manipulativeness, the callousness, the entitlement, and the patterns that go with that, the gaslighting, the invalidation. But you say to yourself, this can't be narcissism. There was a little bit of empathy here. Like, now you're confused, right? This research that these folks have done on the dark empath shows us that it's not that simple. The researchers use this term because the dark empaths in their study, the way they measured them, they definitely had more empathy than the dark triad people, but they didn't have more empathy than traditional empaths or just regular typical folks. But they had some, much more than a traditional psychopathically narcissistic person, just enough to trick someone. And empathy is also a complicated trait. Empathy isn't just about crying with someone else or feeling someone else's pain. There is what is termed affective empathy. It's also, we could call it emotional empathy. That's that sort of emotionally connected empathy, but there's also something called cognitive empathy. This is sort of more of an intellectual understanding of someone else's emotions or experience. I can understand why you feel that way. That's an example of cognitive empathy. I often think that cognitive empathy isn't that satisfying. It can feel sort of intellectual and sort of distant, rather than the empathy of someone who really feels connected to you emotionally and seems to genuinely care. Even if the person didn't even ever have the emotional experience you're sharing, they seem to be able to be present with that. You don't see that as much in cognitive empathy. But the big risk of a person who is able to combine empathy and these dark traits is manipulation. Their empathic abilities of the dark empath can be used to almost download what makes another person tick, and then weaponize or mobilize that knowledge to take advantage of or manipulate another person. In that way, they're actually like really good salespeople. To know what makes another person tick, you need to pay attention to them, and you need to take a minute to get to know them. The dark empath is much better at that than the dark triad person would ever be. In fact, the dark triad type person is more likely to get what they want through menace or threat or fear or passive aggression, while the dark empath may get it by creating a sense of false trust and then being a more effective manipulator as a result. This concept of the dark empath may actually explain why people fall in love with narcissists and then feel blindsided when it goes upside down, because at one point you did feel understood by this dark empath. Dark empaths are extroverted, so they do well in a crowd, which can also foster a sense of trust, because you're like, hey, they seem to be getting along with everyone. And since our society and our culture, at least in the United States, tend to be much more pro-extrovert and anti-introvert, people who can do well in a crowd are often judged through a bit of a halo effect. They must be good, they get along with everyone. It's this tricky combination of having high extroversion, empathy, and then still having some of those dark triad type patterns. So this kind of dark empath will still appear egocentric and still behave badly in relationships. The other issue is that dark empaths are also lower in a trait called agreeableness. In fact, Paulus, that researcher I mentioned before, he actually characterizes grandiose narcissists as disagreeable extroverts. So I actually think dark empaths may just be a twist on that. Agreeableness is my favorite trait. It's a trait characterized by empathy, humility, modesty, trust, and interpersonal flexibility. So when a person is lower in agreeableness while also having some empathy, means that this is a person who's boastful, arrogant, distrustful, and kind of takes a it's my way or the highway kind of path. And in general, the opposite of agreeableness is antagonism, which is the trait that links the dark empaths and the dark triads. See how that works? Puzzle starting to fit. The authors of this study I'm talking about make a very important point. Just having empathy isn't good enough. Empathy isn't just like a magic disinfectant that cleans away all of the interpersonally uncomfortable patterns of narcissism and being politically Machiavellian and psychopathic. Antagonistic people are antagonistic people. Some just have a little more empathy. They're still very difficult and manipulative. This research on the dark empath may actually clarify why people fall for narcissists in the first place. They have just enough empathy to draw people close, but not enough to result in consistently treating them well. The dark empath may very well be the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing. I really love their research study because I think it speaks to how nuanced these patterns are, and it really gave an interesting framework to think about this idea of the dark empath, to think about how people fall in love with narcissists in the first place and then end up in this really toxic relationship with somebody incredibly egotistical and egocentric. their research really sheds a lot of light on that. So thanks again. If any of you have ever met a dark empath, drop that in the comments, because now you might have a way to explain how this person with empathy was also kind of awful. Thanks again.